Good morning from what was a sunny but now wet Sydney, Australia. Coastie is on tour. We've got the lovely Opera House behind me. Now, the other day I was on a tour here in Sydney, and the tour guide said the British first landed here and settled in Sydney on the 26th of January 1788. And that rang a bell in my mind because that was also the same date, 26th of January 1841 though, that the British planted the flag in Hong Kong. So today's episode we're going to walk about the city, mainly in the Rocks region just to my left, and to find out any similarities and differences between the British colony here in Sydney and British Hong Kong. Let's go! Now, before we start, it's been noticeable since arriving here in Australia, and before actually being on websites, looking at museums, that Australia are doing everything they can to respect the people who were first here, the Indigenous people of Australia, who are thought to have been here between 50 and 100,000 years before the British arrived in 1788. I guess this has links to Hong Kong in a way, although not as old as that. The tribes of Hong Kong, the Punti, the Hoklo, the Hakka and the Tanka boat people were living in Hong Kong for 500 to 1,000 years before the British arrived in 1841. And we can make links between the Indigenous people of both places, Hong Kong and here in Australia. People tended to live pretty peacefully. They were farmers, fishermen, and although there were disputes and quarrels and some fights between the different Indigenous peoples, it was pretty much a calm place to live. Hong Kong, of course, had pirates, so people did have to be aware of pirates and tigers. More on that later this year. On around January 20th, 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip arrived here in the harbour. He'd been in Botany Bay where the other convict ships were, and then sailed to what is now Manly. He then came down here and realised that, like all settlements, you need a good water supply, and the good water supply was here at Circular Quay, just over here. A stream called Tank Stream fed a lot of fresh water down here. So the British decided that on 26th of January 1788, this would be their settlement, not Botany Bay, further down the coast. We can draw parallels to Hong Kong here. The British had sought other islands around Hong Kong, including places like Ma Wan, much smaller island than Hong Kong, but it was the water supply on Hong Kong Island that had provided water for British ships for decades before 1841, when the British arrived, that they decided it was Hong Kong Island where they wanted to settle. In 1789, the British realised that this area wasn't great for farmland, so they went down the Parramatta River further into the harbour and found beautiful fertile land down there. Similarly in Hong Kong, the British built dairies on the west side of Hong Kong Island, but Hong Kong Island wasn't great for fertile land, and that's why in 1860 Britain acquired the Kowloon Peninsula, and then in 1898, the Second Treaty of Peking, it acquired the Northern New Territories, or the New Territories should I say, and that allowed a lot of farmland to grow food for the growing population in Hong Kong. So you're probably saying, Coastie, why did the British want to come to Australia so far away from home? Well, really it was the loss of the American colonies in the late 1700s that forced Britain's hand. We used to send all our convicts over to America, and then after the American independence we needed somewhere new, and this was decided to be a new penal colony for the British Empire. Hong Kong was very different. Hong Kong has always been a trading base mainly. Britain used to trade with the Chinese in Canton, now modern day Guangzhou, but following the First Opium War, stricter limits on the British trading in South China, Hong Kong Island was ceded to the British, and the British really used it as a trading base, certainly for the first 50-60 years. Right across from Circular Quay, where the boats are just leaving, we have the Cadman Cottage. Now this is reputed to be the oldest cottage in Australia. owned by John Cadman, who stole a horse in Worcestershire, I believe it was Bewdley, and was sent out here. Now you could be sent out for 7 years hard labour, 14 years hard labour, or lifetime hard labour. What do you think he got for stealing a horse? Yep, that was it. It was all his life. He was sent here for whole life hard labour, and he lived here with his wife Elizabeth. Now him and Elizabeth lived here happily. Actually his sentence was commuted after a certain amount of time, and he became the superintendent of boats, coxswain if you will, here. And this house was also used as a police station, a morgue, I think it's been a museum at some stage, amongst other things. So this is the oldest house reputedly here in the city of Sydney. But what is it in Hong Kong? Some believe it is Murray House, but that was more of a home for soldiers. It was a barracks. So what is the oldest continuously lived in home in Hong Kong? If you know the answer, write it in the comments below. Now, just like Hong Kong, this building used to be on the waterfront at one stage when it was first built, but is now 50 meters away from the harbour side. And this is similar to Hong Kong in that we've got massive land reclamation in Hong Kong. Right, let's head up to George Street and find some pubs. Corner of Argyle Street and George Street. Of course, we've got an Argyle Street in Kowloon in Hong Kong. But George Street here, this is the oldest street here in Australia. George Street, named after King George, who was king at the time. And of course, in Hong Kong, we have our first road, which was Queen's Road. So both first roads named after kings and queens of Britain. There we go. Now, this road actually was first quite a dusty road when it first started, and in the 1880s they decided to put wooden blocks down quite a lot of the roads here in Sydney, including this one here in George Street. It caused less dust, it was easier to clean, and it was less noisy for people living in the houses all around it. Right, there should be a pub that's reputed to be the oldest one in Australia just down here. Let's see if we can find it. Here it is, the Fortune of War pub. Sydney's oldest pub since 1828. Well, I did a guided tour the other day. Apparently there are 3 pubs like this that all say they're the oldest pub, but this is certainly one of the oldest. And the old police station, I think from the 1880s, is right next door, next to the old bank, which is now a Starbucks. Now, of course, with convicts being the first people here from the Western civilization, there were lots of pubs, lots of alcohol being consumed. So in those early days here, it was quite a rowdy place, quite a lot of crime going on, just like in Hong Kong. So this area, the Rocks, with lots of pubs, I would liken to somewhere like Wan Chai in Hong Kong today. Right, let's head further into the Rocks, find out a bit more information about the history of this place. Still got lots of pubs all around here in the Rocks, still a drinking culture. But in World War I actually, the drinking time was reduced and pubs were shut at 6 p.m. and this was called the 6 o'clock swill. And at 5 o'clock basically everyone piled into the pubs to try and drink as much as they could, get as drunk as they could by 6 o'clock. Now this stayed on until as late as 1967 in South Australia and also in New Zealand, when later times were eventually brought in. This was thought to have been brought in World War I to help with public morality and sort of an austerity measure to help the war effort as well. Imagine that, 6 o'clock. Can you imagine Australians not being allowed to drink after 6 p.m? Not a chance now. As I said, Sydney was a dangerous place back in the 1800s, and none more so than coming down these alleyways. You would have larricking gangs here, men ready to pounce and beat you up. You would have ladies of the night on the edge of these alleyways. You can see some here maybe perchance. They would entice the sailors coming off the ships out of the pubs drunk into these alleyways, and then they would be set upon by these larrikins, stripped bare, and all their worldly possessions taken by these gangs. So it really was a vicious place back in the 1800s. Now right behind me we have the Reynolds Cottage well. Now Hong Kong Island, as far as I know, didn't have that many wells, but up in the new territories, all of the ancient walled villages of the tribes, the clans up there, did have their own water source from a well. Right at the end of George Street here, you can see some very Flemish, Dutch looking wharves opposite. But I've just spotted something on the other side of the road, and that is the wooden tiles that I was talking about earlier. So they've left these tiles here to show exactly what it would have looked like back in 1880 when these wooden tiles were put on the floor. They were actually called Blockboys, the people who made the road surfaces here, and I think it was between 1880 1930 when the streets around the rocks were made of these wooden blocks. They were washed down every night, so actually it kept the roads clean, and as I said before, it wasn't dusty at all, which was one of the major problems here in Sydney. Now the Aboriginal people indigenous to this area called the rocks Talawalada, and just the other side of the bridge where we're headed now, they call that Tara. So let's head off and find Tara. Now in the 1820s, free immigration was allowed to Australia, which opened up the colony to lots of British but other nations as well. The Irish being one of the nations that settled here. Of course, a lot of Irish convicts as well came over in the late 1700s as well. There was a skirmish with Irish convicts back in the late 1700s, and that's why one of the batteries that we're going to see in just a moment had to be built back in the 1700s. Now, just down from Cumberland Street, we have a tale of a very interesting guy called George Cribb. Now, he was a convict who arrived here in 1808. He was a butcher and set up a butcher's shop and a slaughter yard just here. Now, very similar to Kennedy Town in Hong Kong. That's where cattle were slaughtered in Hong Kong, but he was doing it right here in the middle of the rocks. Making a lot of money and became very rich. He even had racehorses at one point, but the police couldn't figure out just where was he getting this money from. Now in 1811 he got married to Fanny Barnett. Now Fanny Barnett was his second wife, but his first wife, who he was still married to, was back in Britain. Now when she said she was coming out to join him, he paid Fanny a large sum of money and sent her back to the UK. I believe he outlived his first wife, Martha, and then remarried for a third time. Now, it wasn't until well after his death, when they started digging here and getting the archaeology from beneath the surface, that they found what they were looking for. In recent years, they have found a still to make alcohol beneath his land. So that's where he was getting his money from, selling alcohol. Alleyway here is known as Gallows Hill. Back in the day, here in Sydney, in the early days, late 1700s, early 1800s, the best form of entertainment was a good hanging. And people would gather here on the hill, looking down into the police station courtyard to see who was getting hung that day. Now apparently there is a plaque showing the first ever spot where a hanging took place here in Hong Kong. It's on the corner of Harrington and Essex Street, so let's try and find it. It's around here somewhere. And And here it is, there's a green plaque, so this must be it. This is the site of the first execution. Thomas Barrett, a First Fleet convict, was hanged near this place on 27th of February 1788 for stealing provisions and was buried nearby. Provisions, there we go. Not a lot to be hanged for back in 1788. 1 month, 1 day after the British first arrived here. Right, just realised I'm right opposite my apartment that I'm renting, so I'll nip in for a cup of tea. I'll see you in a few seconds. Join me next time when we take a look under Sydney's famous harbour bridge, sup a wonderful pint of ale for one of Sydney's oldest pubs, and one with a gruesome tale. We ponder the name of a street with the same name as Hong Kong's first governor, take a trip around the New South Wales Parliament, and learn about their system of government. See how time was told in the 19th century. Wander through Australia's first mint. Learn about Australia's ecclesiastical history before finding out how alcohol and opium were used as a tool to subjugate the Indigenous people of Australia and Hong Kong. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and catch you soon on the next Coastie Explores.